Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm here with y'all Bible stories for February the 25th, 2024. We'll be talking about David, the most powerful man slash camera in the Bible. Okay, let's begin. In the biblical narrative of the books of Samuel, David is described as a young shepherd and harpist who gains fame and becomes a hero by killing Goliath. He becomes a favorite of Saul, the first king of Israel, but is forced to go into hiding when Saul suspects that David is trying to take his throne. After Saul and his son Jonathan are killed in battle, David is anointed king by the tribe of Judah and eventually all the tribes of Israel. He conquers Jerusalem, making it the capital of a united Israel, and brings the Ark of the Covenant to the city. He commits adultery with Bathsheba and arranges the death of her husband, Uriah the Hittite. David's son Absalom later tries to overthrow him, but David returns to Jerusalem after Absalom's death to continue his reign. David desires to build a temple to Yahweh, but he is denied because of the bloodshed in his reign. He dies at age 70 and chooses Solomon, his son with Bathsheba, as his successor instead of his eldest son, Adonijah. David is honored as the ideal king and the forefather of the future Hebrew Messiah in Jewish prophetic literature, and many psalms are attributed to him. David is also richly represented in post-biblical Jewish written and oral tradition and referenced in the New Testament. Early Christians interpreted the life of Jesus of Nazareth in light of reference to the Hebrew Messiah and to David. Jesus is described as being directly descended from David in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. In the Quran and Hadith, David is described as an Israelite, king as well as prophet of Allah. The biblical David has inspired many interpretations in arts and literature over the centuries. David was a shepherd boy who grew up to be a king of God's people. In this story, David, the young shepherd boy, whom Samuel had recently anointed as king, is brought to Saul. Saul needs David to play the lyre so that he would feel better. Much to everyone's surprise, David goes to battle against Goliath. King David is one of the most well-known figures in Jewish history. His life was filled with much happiness and much pain. He is known by many titles: David the Conqueror, David the Horseman, David the Street Singer, David the Shepherd, and David the Penitent. King David was a descendant of Judah as well as Ruth and was promised by God that his children will rule Israel forever. Until this very day, he is remembered by Jews everywhere who still chant his psalms in prayer in times of joy and sorrow. You ain't lying. David was born in Bethlehem in the land of Judah in the year 2854, 907 BCE, during the era of the prophets. He was the youngest of 7 sons and only 10 generations removed from Judah, one of Jacob's 12 sons. He was also a descendant of Ruth, the famous Moabite convert, a red-cheeked, bright-eyed, and handsome young man. He used to tend to the sheep of his father Jesse. Now the people had recently anointed Saul as the first king of Israel, but Saul soon sinned and fell into divine grace. It was then that the prophet Samuel, as directed by God, anointed David as king of Israel, and so his ascension to the throne began. David and Saul. King Saul and David's first encounter occurred when an evil spirit gripped King Saul. His advisors suggested he bring in a skilled musician who would play for the king to ease his mind. One of the attendants recommended that the king bring in young David, whom he knew to be a skilled performer. Little did Saul know that the young lad who was playing before him was destined to be his successor. Okay, next, David and Goliath. At this time, King Saul was battling the Philistines, longtime enemies of Israel. In the valley of Eli, the two armies were poised for a battle, with nothing but a hill separating them. The Philistines vastly outnumbered Saul's army. A Philistine giant, Goliath, appeared on the hill, and his wolves came roaring down like thunder. Why should you come out to engage in battle? I am the Philistine champion, and you are Saul's servants. Choose one of your men and let him come down against me. If he overcomes me and come back and kills me, we will become your slaves. But if I beat him and kill him, you shall be our slaves and serve us. The sight of the fierce giant, 6 cubits in a span, about 10 feet 5 tall, a towering figure on the hill, clad in armor, iron, and brass from head to foot, filled the Jews with great terror. There was not a single man in the Israelite camp who dared accept the challenge. Day after day, for 40 days, the mighty giant appeared on the hill to repeat his challenge morning and evening. Then young David, filled with courage, approached the giant with just a staff, a slingshot, and 5 stones, and with one shot he slew the giant where he stood. He proceeded to cut off his head and presented it to King Saul. The Philistines, witnessing this event, fled in fear, and David was a national hero. True friendship. A love that is not dependent on anything will never perish. An example of this is the love between David and Jonathan. When David overcame Goliath in a battle and was brought to King Saul's palace to be rewarded, he met Jonathan, the son of King Saul, for the first time. At that moment, their love and respect for each other was first founded. When David finished speaking with Saul, Jonathan's soul became bound up with the soul of David. Jonathan loved David as himself. This bond between two proved itself even in the most difficult of times. Later on, King Saul began to fear that David wanted his throne and sought to kill him. Despite knowing that David posed a potential threat to his place in line to the crown, Jonathan loved David and protected him from his father's attempt to have him killed. David as the warrior. King Saul then selected David to be a warrior in his army. David's success was so great, the verse relates, when the troops came home and David returned from killing the Philistines, the women of all the towns of Israel came out. The women sang as they danced and they chanted, Saul had slain his thousands, David, his 10 of thousands. King Saul started to grow envious of David's glory and kept a watchful and jealous eye on David. King Saul versus David. God continued to grant David much success in battle. King Saul started to fear that David's fame and power would one day help him usher the throne. This led to a war between the two men. It started when David was playing the harp for the king, and a cloud of fear and anger suddenly fell upon the king. King Saul took hold of a spear and threw it at David. By divine intervention, David managed to escape. David fled south to the mountains of Judah, his home. He needed food and weapons. He obtained these from the city of Nob. At that time, Nob was a holy place, distinguished because it housed the tabernacle and the priests. David was taken in and cared for by Amalek and his fellow priests. This provided David with the opportunity to stock up on food and weapons. During his stay, he was seen by Doeg the Edomite, who was a servant of King Saul. Fearing this, David escaped to the city of Gath, and then sought refuge in one of the caves near Adullam in the plains of Judah. It was a secure retreat, and David's brothers and all his father's household came to him. His solitary abode was soon known, and he was joined by many who was in distress or in debt or had any other reason to be discontented. Doeg the Edomite related news of David's whereabouts to the king. King Saul embarked on a quest to hunt down and kill David. There were two times during this hunt when King Saul was at the mercy of David, and instead of taking advantage of the situation and killing the king, David spared his life as he dared not to lay his hand upon God's anointed one. It was only after David spared his life for the second time that King Saul finally retreated and let David be. Death of Saul and Jonathan. King Saul was then waging a mighty war against the Philistines. David was in Ziklag, where he had retreated in fear that King Saul would change his mind and hunt him again. When he heard that Saul and his son Jonathan had died in battle, David sincerely mourned the death of Saul and Jonathan and the defeat of Israel. David crowned as king. After the death of Saul, David saw that the time had come for him to emerge from exile and take over the leadership of his people. He left Ziklag and proceeded to the ancient city of Hebron in Judah. There the people of Judah gathered and anointed him king. In the prime of his life he was 30 years old. David was wise in counsel, prompt in action, God-fearing and earnest, and the people recognized him as the most suitable candidate for the throne in those troubled times. True. King David's ascension to the throne did not go unprotested. Abner, previously a general in King Saul's army, said that the crown should remain in the family of King Saul. However, his forces were beaten swiftly, and he had no choice but to acknowledge the reality of David being king over all of Israel. The people swarmed to Hebron to pay homage to their beloved king and to anoint him publicly. The occasion turned into a great national celebration that lasted for 3 days. In time, he moved his capitals from Hebron to Jerusalem. King David's victories. Israel was still surrounded by many hostile tribes. King David maintained a standing army consisting of 12 divisions, each one representing one tribe of Israel. Each division numbered 24,000 men. Thus, King David's army totaled 288,000 men. Okay, more than that. David knew that before there could be real peace for his people, he would have to subdue the neighboring enemies. He fought and subdued the Philistines, invaded Moab, slew most of their soldiers, and imposed a heavy tribute upon the people. Then King David marched against Hadadezer, king of Zobah in Syria, whose empire extended from the vicinity of Damascus eastward to the borders of the Ephraimites. He vanquished his army, subjected his people, and sent the best of his horses to Jerusalem. This unpreparable succession of victories not only established King David's power, but also spread his name abroad. He was regarded as one of the mightiest rulers in the East. You want about his wives? King David's wives. While King David had numerous wives, only 8 are named in the book of Samuel. Michal, Michelle, Abinadab, Abigail, Moshe, Haggit, Avatar, Eglah, and Bathsheba. While not much detail is given about these women, we do know information about some of them. Michelle was the second eldest daughter of King Saul. When the king was confronted by Goliath, he promised that the warriors defeat this giant would be wed to one of his daughters. David came and slew the giant. King Saul proposed that David married his eldest daughter, Merab. However, at that time, Merab had already been given in marriage to another. King Saul then discovered that his daughter Michal wished to marry David. The king requested from David as a wedding dowry to marry Michal 100 foreskins from his enemies, the Philistines. King Saul had hoped that David would fall in battle, and he grew fearful of David as explained earlier. But David succeeded and took Michal as his wife. Next, Abigail is described as a wise and beautiful woman. It happened that when David and his men were fleeing from King Saul, he went to a wealthy man named Nobal to replenish his supply of food and weaponry. David expected Nobal to act generously towards him, as he had protected and did not take advantage of his shepherds, who was him throughout his travels. However, Nobal, a fool and a drunk, refused and even mocked David. When his refusal reported back to David, he made ready for war against Nobal. Abigail, the wife of Nobal, heard about this great commotion and quickly diffused the situation by running ahead and greeting David with plenty of food and gifts. 10 days later, God struck Nobal and he died. Upon hearing Nobal's death, David sought to take Abigail as his wife and propose to her. King David and Bathsheba. It happened sometime after David was proclaimed king that he was taking a stroll on the rooftops and he beheld the beauty of a woman named Bathsheba. David inquired about the woman and was informed that she was married to a soldier named Uriah. Now David's passion for Bathsheba was strong, and he wished to marry her. He sent Uriah to the front lines of battle, knowing full well that he was giving him a death sentence. When news of Uriah's death reached David, he took Bathsheba as his wife. God was displeased with David's action and sent the prophet Nathan to rebuke the king, knowing that he sinned. David sat in penance until God forgave him. The story raises many questions that are beyond the scope of this article, but a couple of points need to be addressed in order to bring some clarity to the story. According to the Talmud, the reason King David sought to marry Bathsheba and was willing to go to great lengths to do so was because he saw by divine inspiration that he was destined to marry her and bear the next king of Israel. Furthermore, before sending Uriah off to battle, he had a quick discussion with him regarding the war, in the midst of which King David gave Uriah a command to go home, a command that Uriah did not obey. He told the king, "The ark in Israel and Judah are located at Sukkot, and my master Jobed and your majesty men are camped in the open. How can I go home?" Referring to Job, David's general, as my master in front of the king was tantamount to treason, and Uriah deserved the death penalty for his rebellion. However, King David sentenced him to death under the guise of sending him to war, so people should not say King David had Uriah killed so that he could take his wife. Justified through his action may be, they were still displeasing to God. Nathan the prophet informed the king that his first child he would have with Bathsheba would die as a consequence of his actions. Shortly after this, Bathsheba gave birth to a boy who fell critically ill. David fasted and prayed in the hope of rescinding God's decree, but alas, on the seventh day, the baby passed away. David accepted this as part of his penance, got up from fasting, and prostrated before God. Okay, David's other sons. David had a number of sons, three of whom, Absalom, Abinah, and Solomon, became prominent in the history of Israel. Absalom was a handsome, ambitious, and charismatic prince. He believed that he was destined to be king and feared that his elderly father would pass the crown on to young Solomon, as King David was divinely inspired to. And so he rallied some of the greatest warriors and advisors and led a revolt against his father. News of the revolt broke David's heart, and instead of confronting his son in an all-out war, he fled on foot with some of his loyal servants. Absalom was determined to chase down his father, and a bloody battle ensued. Realizing that his father has the upper hand, Absalom fled in terror and dismay as he was riding through the woods on his swift mule. His long locks of his hair got caught in the spreading branches of a large tree. Unable to extricate himself, he remained suspended, for his mule had escaped. One of David's servants brought this intelligence to Job, King David's general, who gave the order that Absalom be put to death. Even though Absalom had caused great troubles for his father, King David nonetheless grieved and mourned for the death of his son. Unfortunately, Absalom was not the only son to seek the throne. Abinah also had grand plans to obtain the crown, but King David put on immediate halt to any other upsurers by having Solomon anointed and pronounced king of Israel. David lives forever. At the age of 70, King David passed away. It is said that before his death, he asked God to reveal exactly when he would leave this world. God, not wishing to divulge this information, merely informed him on which day of the week he would die. Shabbat. Shabbat, that Saturday, David made sure to be constantly studying Torah throughout every Sabbath so that the angel of death, Satan, would not be able to take his soul. When David's time on earth came to an end, the angel of death distracted the king from his learning by shaking the trees in his garden. The king climbed the stairs to see what the commotion was, but one of the steps broke underneath his feet. Startled, the king paused from his studies, and it was that moment that the king passed away. David the composer. King David was not just another figure in history. He lives on to this day. One of the king one of King David's greatest works and arguably his greatest legacy was the Book of Psalms. During his spare time, King David would study the Torah and sing songs of praise to God. The Book of Psalms had been a refuge for the Jewish people in their times of trouble throughout history. Whenever Jews are in distress, they open up the Book of Psalms and cry out to God. Solomon in the Temple. King David wished to build the Holy Temple in Jerusalem as a dwelling place for God. However, Nathan the prophet told King David that it was not his destiny to build the Holy Temple, as he had spilled much blood. His son Solomon would build the temple. Nonetheless, King David wished to participate in any way he could, and so he instructed Solomon in the building process and procured the necessary materials for the construction. King David was not only involved in the building of the first holy temple, but would be involved in the building of the third, as the Messiah would be a direct descendant of King David, and he will take us out of this exile, build the final resting place for God, and lead us to a world filled with peace and tranquility. Okay, y'all? That is the story of King David in the Bible, most powerful man in the Bible, okay? Slash camera, slash phone. Told y'all. Enjoy.